I pushed through the kitchen doors and told the chef in front of the entire line to stop cooking. Right now, every ticket on the rail. The whole kitchen went silent, every cook staring at me like I had walked in speaking a different language. My manager heard it from the dining room and came through those doors seconds later, demanding to know what exactly gave me the right to shut down her kitchen in the middle of service. If you have ever known you were right, before you had a single word to prove it, this channel is built for exactly that feeling. Subscribe if you want more of these. Now here is everything that happened before I walked through those doors. My name is Renata Coelho, though everyone at the restaurant called me Ren, because the full name took too long to shout across a dining room during a rush. The restaurant was called Aldrine, a mid-sized place downtown that did modern Portuguese and Mediterranean food, the kind of menu that looked simple on paper and was murderously precise in execution. White tablecloths on the weekends, candles in glass jars, a wine list longer than the food menu. It was the sort of restaurant that people saved up for, the sort where a bad night could end up in a review that mattered. I got the job through a woman named Solange, who used to manage a diner where I worked 2 summers earlier, back when I was still finishing my degree in nutrition science. Solange had moved on to bigger things and eventually landed as the general manager at Aldrine. And when I texted her looking for serving work while I finished my coursework, she brought me in for a trial shift almost immediately. That trial shift became a real position within a week, mostly because I did not drop anything and I could recite the entire wine list back without notes by the 3rd day. Solange liked people who paid attention. She used to say that most servers listen to a table just enough to write down the order, and that the good ones listen enough to know what the table actually wants. Solange herself was not the caricature of a stressed restaurant manager that you see in movies. She was calm in a way that made the rest of us calm. She had run the floor at 3 different restaurants over almost 15 years, and she had a habit of walking the dining room with her hands folded behind her back, checking candles, checking napkin folds, checking whether a table needed water before they even noticed they were thirsty themselves. She was fair. If a server messed up an order, she never yelled. She just asked what happened and then quietly fixed it with the kitchen. Everyone respected her, including the chef, which was not a small thing, because the chef at Aldrine did not respect very many people. His name was Tomás Vieira, and he had trained in Lisbon before working his way through 2 well-regarded kitchens in New York, and eventually landing at Aldrine as executive chef 4 years before I ever set foot in the place. Tomás was not cruel, not in the way people imagine chefs to be from television. He did not throw pans or scream obscenities at the line, but he had a standard, and the standard was absolute, and if you crossed it, even by accident, he had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you had personally insulted his entire family lineage going back 3 generations. The cooks feared him and loved him in roughly equal measure, which I came to understand was the normal condition for people who worked under someone who actually knew what he was doing. I want to be honest about something before I go further into this story, because I think it matters for understanding what happened later. I did not walk into that kitchen because I had some kind of gut feeling or a flash of intuition. I do not believe in that kind of thing. Not really. Not in a professional sense. I walked into that kitchen because of one specific physical detail that I noticed with my own eyes, something that most people in that room would have walked past without a second look. And it took me the better part of 45 minutes to piece together exactly why it mattered. By the time I understood it fully, I was almost out of time to do anything about it. The night in question was a Friday, and it was not an ordinary Friday. Aldrine was hosting a private party in the back dining room, a corporate group of about 32 people from a pharmaceutical distribution company, the kind of group that books an entire section for a full evening and orders the tasting menu across the board. It was, by a wide margin, the largest single check the restaurant had run in the 6 weeks I had worked there, and Solange had been talking about it for days. She had gone over the seating chart with me twice, had confirmed which servers would run, which stations, had checked and rechecked the allergy sheet that the event coordinator had sent over about 10 days earlier. 2 people in the group had shellfish allergies, 1 had a tree nut allergy, and 1, an older man who turned out to be the company's regional vice president, had a documented and fairly severe allergy to a specific class of legumes, something the coordinator had flagged in bold letters at the top of the sheet, underlined twice for emphasis. I remember Solange holding that sheet up during our pre-shift meeting, tapping it with one finger, and saying that if any single plate went out to that table without being checked against this list, she personally would take it as a defeat, and that none of us wanted her to feel defeated on a night this important. It was not said as a threat. It was said the way a captain talks to a crew before a difficult crossing, and everyone in that room, myself included, understood exactly how seriously she meant it. The first 2 courses went out clean. I was not running that table directly. That responsibility belonged to a server named Priya, who had been at Aldrine for almost 2 years, and who moved through a dining room the way some people move through a room they have lived in their entire life, without hesitation, without wasted motion. I was working the stations closer to the kitchen doors that night, running food for 2 other tables and helping bus the private room whenever Priya needed an extra set of hands. That put me walking in and out of that kitchen more times in 90 minutes than I normally did in an entire shift, and it was on maybe my 6th or 7th trip through those doors that I noticed the thing that would not leave my mind for the rest of the night. It was small. It was almost nothing. It was the kind of detail that, if you described it to someone after the fact, would sound like it could not possibly mean anything at all. But something about it sat wrong in my stomach the moment I saw it. And even though I told myself 3 separate times over the next half hour that I was imagining a problem where there was none, the feeling did not go away. If anything, it got sharper every time I passed back through those doors. Every time I glanced toward the far end of the pass, where the 3rd course for the private room was being plated, course by course, plate by plate, moving steadily closer to a table where one wrong ingredient could turn a celebratory dinner into an ambulance ride. I had maybe 20 minutes left before that course would be fully plated and walking out the door, and I still had not said a single word to anyone about what I had seen. I stopped just past the walk-in cooler, pretending to check a stack of side plates that did not actually need checking, and I made myself look again at what had caught my attention. At the far end of the pass, where Thomas kept a small dedicated station for the private party plates, so nothing from the regular dining room could get mixed in with them, there was an open container of what looked like a pale, finely ground flour sitting on the rail, half tucked behind a row of squeeze bottles. It was not labeled in a way I could read from where I stood, and it was not one of the containers I recognized from the normal mise en place, the little labeled tubs of salt and cornstarch and rice flour that lived in the same spots every single night, because Thomas ran an unusually organized station and did not tolerate things being out of place. I had been in that kitchen enough times by then to know roughly where everything lived. Thomas ran his line the way a surgeon runs an operating table, everything exactly where his hand expected it to be, so he never had to look down and search. That was part of why the container caught my eye at all. It was sitting in a spot I did not recognize. in a container I did not recognize, at a station that was, that night specifically, dedicated entirely to a table with a documented and severe legume allergy. I told myself it was probably nothing. Restaurants run out of things constantly, and cooks improvise, and maybe someone had simply grabbed a spare container from a shelf because the usual one was empty, and maybe it was rice flour after all, or tapioca starch, or a dozen other things that would have been completely harmless. I actually managed to convince myself of this for almost 10 minutes, long enough to run 2 more trips out to my own tables, refill water glasses, clear a round of dessert plates from a foretop near the window. But every time I passed back through those doors, my eyes went straight to that same spot on the rail, and the container was still there. And at one point, I saw one of the line cooks, a younger guy named Dylan, who had only been at Aldrine a few weeks longer than I had, dust a small amount of it over what looked like a component for the next course, headed to the private room. That was the moment the feeling stopped being a vague unease and became something closer to alarm, even though I still could not have told you with any certainty exactly what was in that container. I did not have a lab. I did not have a way to test it. All I had was a pattern that did not fit, sitting in a kitchen where I had spent enough hours to know what fitting looked like. Here is where I have to explain something about myself that matters for the rest of this story, because otherwise none of what I did next makes any sense. Before I went back to school for nutrition science, before I ever set foot in a restaurant as a server, I spent 2 years working weekends and summers in a small commercial bakery owned by my aunt, back in the town where I grew up. It was not a fancy place. It made bread, mostly, and a rotating handful of pastries, and it survived on volume rather than prestige. But my aunt was fanatical about ingredient substitution because she had, years before I ever worked there, been sued after a customer with a nut allergy had a reaction to a batch of what was supposed to be a plain sourdough loaf that had been contaminated with almond flour left over from a different recipe earlier in the day. After that, she trained every single person who worked in that kitchen, including me, to recognize certain flours and starches on sight and by smell, because she never again wanted an unlabeled container sitting anywhere near an active production line. One of the things she drilled into me over and over, in a way that had honestly annoyed me at the time, because I thought I would never need it again once I stopped working there, was how to recognize the visual and textural differences between common gluten-free flour substitutes. Fava bean flour, in particular, she was almost obsessive about, because fava bean flour and its close relatives showed up more and more often in gluten-free baking blends as a cheap way to add protein and structure. And because fava beans and their relatives sit inside a much larger legume family that includes several allergens, people do not always think to ask about when they say they have a nut allergy or a general legume sensitivity. She used to hold up a small dish of it during training and say, "Look at the color. Look at how it clumps slightly differently than rice flour when you press it with a spoon. Look at the faint smell, slightly grassy, slightly bitter. Nothing like the neutral smell of cornstarch or the sweeter smell of tapioca." Standing in that kitchen on that Friday night, looking at that unlabeled container from maybe 4 meters away under bad lighting, I could not have sworn on anything that it was fava bean flour. I want to be completely honest about that because it matters. I did not have certainty in the way people like to imagine certainty, some clean moment of totally knowing. What I had was a strong suspicion built out of a color that looked wrong for rice flour, a texture I thought I recognized from 4 meters away, and a location on the pass that made absolutely no sense for any ingredient that was supposed to be anywhere near that specific table. I decided I needed to get closer, and that meant finding a reason to be near that station without making it obvious that I was inspecting anything. I picked up an empty tray, the kind we use to bus finish plates, and I walked toward the pass as though I were simply positioning myself to run the next course. Dylan was working fast, plating small mounds of what looked like a chickpea and herb component onto rectangular plates, 4 of them lined up in a row, each one destined for the private room. As I got closer, I could see the container more clearly, and my stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. The flour was pale ivory, almost yellow at the edges where it had been scooped, and it had that same faintly grainy, clumping texture I remembered from my aunt's kitchen, not the fine, powdery uniformity of rice flour or cornstarch. I did not say anything yet. I want to be clear about that, because I think it is important to understanding how this played out. I did not march up to Dylan and accuse him of anything, and I did not go find Solange immediately and announce a crisis based on a container I had only looked at from a few feet away under kitchen lighting. Instead, I did something that, looking back, probably saved me from making a fool of myself if I had been wrong, and also gave me the small piece of information I actually needed. I asked Dylan, as casually as I could manage while stacking dirty plates onto my tray, what that flour was that he was using for the chickpea component. He did not even look up from what he was doing. He said it was a bean flour blend that Thomas had started using about 2 weeks earlier to bulk out the chickpea puree without changing the flavor too much. Something about it being cheaper than using more actual chickpeas and giving a better texture besides. He said it like it was the most unremarkable fact in the world, because to him, it was. He had no idea there was an allergy sheet. He had no idea which specific plates were going to which specific table that night. His job was to plate what the ticket told him to plate, and the ticket did not carry allergy information down to the line cooks, only up at the pass where Tomas was working the far station, checking each finished plate before it went out. That was when the second piece of the puzzle clicked into place for me, and it was almost worse than the first. If the allergy sheet information lived only with Tomas, and Tomas was the one checking plates before they left the pass, then the entire safety of that table depended on Tomas personally remembering, in the middle of a packed Friday service with dozens of other tickets firing at the same time, that this particular ingredient, introduced only 2 weeks earlier as a cost-saving substitution, happened to fall inside the same legume family as the allergy flagged on a sheet he had read once, 10 days earlier, before the ingredient change had even happened. I looked toward the pass. Tomas was moving fast, hands blurring between pans, calling out times to the grill station, his eyes flicking constantly between 6 or 7 things at once the way an experienced chef's eyes do during a rush. He was not a careless man. He was, without question, the most careful cook I had ever watched work. But careful people miss things too, especially when the thing they need to remember was never written down anywhere near the station where the substitution actually happened, and especially when that thing was buried under 10 days of accumulated new information and 100 other details demanding his attention at the exact same moment. I had maybe 15 minutes left before those 4 plates would be finished. Walked to the pass, checked by Tomas against whatever he remembered about that table, and sent out the door toward a man with a documented severe legume allergy. And the more I thought about it, standing there with a tray of dirty dishes in my hands, and my heart starting to climb into my throat, the more certain I became that Thomas would not catch it, not because he was bad at his job, but because nobody had ever told him there was anything to catch. I put the tray down on the edge of the service station and tried to think clearly, which was harder than it sounds with my pulse hammering the way it was. My first instinct, the correct one, the one I should have moved on immediately, was to find Solange. She was the general manager. She had made the allergy sheet a personal point of pride only hours earlier, and she was the person with the actual authority to stop a plate before it left the building. The problem was that Solange was not on the floor. She had stepped into the small office behind the coat check to deal with a vendor phone call about a wine delivery that had come in short. Something I only found out afterward, and in the moment, all I knew was that I had swept the dining room twice with my eyes and could not find her anywhere. I asked another server, a guy named Marcus, who had been running the bar section that night, if he had seen her, and he said she had gone into the office maybe 10 minutes earlier, and he was not sure if she was still in there. 10 minutes felt like an eternity, given what I thought I had maybe 12 or 13 minutes left to work with. I went to the office door and knocked, and there was no answer, and when I tried the handle, it was locked, which meant she had likely stepped out through the back hallway toward the delivery entrance to take the call somewhere quieter, a route that could put her anywhere between the office and the parking lot, depending on how the conversation was going. I want to explain something about what was happening in my head during those few minutes, because I think it is the part of this story people relate to the most, even though it is the part that is hardest to describe. I was not panicking in the sense of losing control. I was thinking with a strange, narrow clarity, running through every option available to me and eliminating them almost as fast as I generated them. Call Solange's cell phone. I did not have her personal number, only ever having texted her through a work messaging app that she might not check while she was on an actual phone call with a vendor. Ask another server to find her. I had already asked Marcus, and he did not know where she was. Wait for her to come back to the floor on her own. That was the option that felt safest in terms of not overstepping anything, and it was also the option that guaranteed those 4 plates would be finished, checked by Tomas, and sent out to that table before she ever walked back through the dining room doors. I went back toward the kitchen entrance and looked through the small round window in the swinging door. Dylan had finished plating the chickpea component and had moved it down the line to where another cook was adding the final garnish, a scatter of microgreens and a drizzle of something from a squeeze bottle. 2 plates already had the garnish. Thomas was at the pass, wiping the rim of a completely different plate with a cloth, glancing up to call a time to the grill, then looking back down. He was maybe 90 seconds from turning his attention to the 4 plates in front of him, checking them the way he checked everything, quickly, competently, and completely, without the one piece of information that would have told him to stop. I made a decision in that moment that I have replayed in my head more times than I could count in the weeks since. I decided that whatever the cost to me personally, whatever rule I was about to break by walking into a working kitchen and interrupting a chef mid-service without a shred of proof beyond a flour I recognized from a bakery job 2 years earlier, and a texture I thought I remembered correctly from 4 meters away under fluorescent lighting, the cost of being wrong about that decision was smaller than the cost of being right and saying nothing. I have to be honest that this is usually the part where I would ask people watching this to think about whether they have ever felt that same kind of certainty pressing down on them with no time left to explain it properly to anyone else. But I think you already know the answer if you are still here listening. So instead, I will just tell you what I actually said in the comments below when I posted an earlier version of this story, because a surprising number of you wrote back that you had lived through some version of this exact feeling in a job that had nothing to do with restaurants at all, an assembly line, a hospital floor, a construction site, and I would genuinely like to hear which of those it was for you. So if you have a story like that sitting in your chest right now, this is your invitation to actually type it out instead of just scrolling past. I pushed through the swinging doors before I had fully finished thinking through what I was going to say, which, in hindsight, was probably the only way I would have actually gone through with it. Because if I had stopped to plan a calm, professional sentence, I think the moment would have passed me by entirely. The heat hit me first, the way it always did when you came from the cool air of the dining room into the wall of heat that lived permanently near the flat tops and the ovens. Then the noise, the clatter of pans, the hiss of something searing, Dylan calling out that he needed more herbs for the next ticket, and then, cutting through all of it before I had even fully processed forming the words in my own head, I heard my own voice, louder and sharper than I had ever used it inside that building, shouting for everyone to stop. I did not say it calmly. I did not say it the way you would explain a problem to a colleague. It came out closer to the kind of shout you would use if you saw someone about to step backward off a curb into traffic. A pure alarm sound wrapped loosely around actual words, something like, "Stop, stop, right now. Do not send those plates." And I think it was that quality, the raw urgency of it, rather than any authority behind it, that made the entire kitchen actually freeze for a full second the way people freeze at a fire alarm rather than at an instruction. Dylan's hands stopped mid-motion. The cook working the garnish station set down the squeeze bottle so fast it nearly tipped over. Even the sound of the exhaust hood seemed louder in the sudden absence of clattering pans and cook talk. Tomas turned toward me with an expression that was somewhere between disbelief and genuine confusion, the cloth still in his hand, and for a moment he did not say anything at all, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had immediately started yelling back at me. I think, if I am being fair to him, and I want to be fair to him, because everything that happened afterward only makes sense if you understand that he was not the villain of this story at any point. He was trying to process why a server, someone who had no business being on that side of the pass during active service, had just screamed a command into his kitchen like the building was on fire. It was in that half second of frozen silence that I heard the door behind me swing open again, and Solange's voice, sharp with an urgency of her own, asking what on earth was going on in her kitchen, and why every single person in it looked like they had just seen a ghost. I will tell you exactly what I said to both of them, word for word, because I think the way I explained myself in that moment is the entire reason anyone believed me long enough to actually check. But before I get to that, I want to walk you through the 90 seconds that came right before I opened my mouth to explain, because those 90 seconds are where I almost lost my nerve completely. Standing there, with both of them staring at me, Tomas with his cloth still hanging loose in one hand, and Solange with her arms already crossing over her chest, in the particular way she crossed them, when she was trying to stay calm rather than actually feeling calm, I understood that I had maybe 10 seconds before one of them decided I had lost my mind entirely and simply walked me back out to the dining room to cool off. So I did not waste time apologizing or hedging the way I might have in a calmer moment. I said, as clearly and as fast as I could manage while still trying to sound like a person and not a siren, that the chickpea plates for the private room could not go out, that the bean flour Dylan had used in the component was very likely in the same family as the legume allergy on the sheet for table number 1 in the back room, and that I recognized the flour because I had worked 2 years in a bakery that dealt with exactly this kind of cross-contamination case before. Tomas's face did something complicated in the space of about 2 seconds. First, There was the residue of irritation, the natural reaction of a man whose kitchen had just been screamed into silence by someone with no standing to do so. Then that irritation folded into something more like alarm as the actual content of what I had said caught up with him, and I watched him glance instinctively down the pass toward the 4 plates sitting there, garnished, nearly finished, one swipe of a towel away from being called out the door. Then his eyes went to Solange, not to me, because in that kitchen, whatever I had just shouted, the actual decision about what happened next did not belong to me, and both of us knew it. Solange asked me, in a voice that was working hard to stay level, how certain I was, and I gave her the only honest answer I had, which was that I was not certain in the way a lab test would be certain, but that I was certain enough that I could not have lived with myself if I said nothing and watched those plates go out the door. I told her about the container, about the color and the texture, about asking Dylan directly what it was, and him confirming it was a bean flour blend introduced only 2 weeks earlier as a cost substitution. I told her that the allergy sheet she herself had shown us during the pre-shift meeting listed a severe legume allergy for the regional vice president at that table, and that nobody had ever connected that allergy note to an ingredient change that happened on the line 2 full weeks after the sheet was written. I could see her doing the math in real time, the same math I had done frantically in my own head only minutes earlier, and I could see the exact moment it landed for her, because her arms uncrossed and her hand went instead to the edge of the pass counter as though she needed something solid to hold on to. She turned to Tomas and asked him directly whether the chickpea component that night used a bean flour blend, and Tomas, to his enormous credit, did not get defensive or dismissive, even though every instinct in a busy chef during a packed Friday service would have pushed him toward exactly that. He walked the 2 steps down the line, picked up the open container himself, turned it over in his hand, looking for a label that was not there, because it had been decanted from a bulk bag earlier that week, and nobody had bothered to relabel the smaller working container, a completely ordinary kitchen shortcut that under any other circumstance would never have mattered at all. He confirmed it was a fava bean-based blend, something he had started using specifically because it browned slightly better than straight chickpea puree and cost less per case, a decision he had made entirely on his own, without any reason to think it intersected with anything on an allergy sheet he had read once, more than a week before he ever placed the order for the new ingredient. I watched something settle over his face that was not anger at me, not really, but a kind of stunned recognition of how close the mistake had come to happening, in a way that had nothing to do with carelessness and everything to do with 2 pieces of information that had simply never been in the same room together at the same time. The allergy sheet lived with the front of house managers and the servers running that section. The ingredient substitution lived entirely inside his own head as a small operational decision made in a supply order 2 weeks earlier. Nobody had ever built a bridge between those 2 facts, and on any other night, with any other table, that gap would have meant nothing at all. Solange did not hesitate for very long once Tomas confirmed it. She told him to hold every plate from that station immediately, pulled her phone out to call the coordinator for the private event, to quietly confirm the specific allergy details one more time before anything else moved, and sent Dylan to start an entirely new batch of the component using plain chickpeas with no substitute flour at all, which would cost the kitchen almost 20 minutes. They did not really have to spare during a service already running at full capacity. It was, in every practical sense, exactly the disruption Solange had said during the pre-shift meeting that she did not want to see happen that night, and it was happening because of something I had done by walking into a kitchen and shouting at a chef with no real evidence beyond my own memory of a flour I had learned to recognize working part-time at my aunt's bakery years earlier. That should have been the end of the tension for the evening, the moment where everyone exhaled and moved on with the relief of a disaster narrowly avoided. It was not, and I think this is the part of the story that surprises people most when I tell it, because the crisis with the allergy was resolved within about 2 minutes of Thomas confirming the flour. But the crisis with me was really only just beginning. Once the immediate danger had passed, Solange turned her attention fully to me for the first time since walking through those doors, and the calm, urgent focus she had been directing at the allergy problem shifted into something colder and more measured. The look of a manager assessing what had just happened to the authority structure of her own kitchen in front of an entire line of cooks. She asked me, in a tone that was controlled but unmistakably sharp, what exactly gave me the standing to walk into her kitchen mid-service and issue a command to her executive chef in front of his entire staff. She reminded me, and she did not need to raise her voice to make the words land hard, that servers did not have the authority to stop the kitchen, that there was a chain of command specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of chaos, and that, if I had been wrong, if that flour had turned out to be ordinary rice flour after all, I would have caused a significant service disruption during the single most important private event the restaurant had hosted in months, based on nothing more than a guess. I understood, standing there in the heat of that kitchen, with every cook on the line pretending very hard to be busy while clearly listening to every word, that Solange was not entirely wrong to be angry. And that is the part I think people sometimes miss when they hear this story secondhand. She was not being unreasonable. She was doing exactly what a competent, experienced manager is supposed to do when the normal chain of command inside her kitchen gets bypassed by someone with no formal authority to bypass it, someone whose only credential was 2 years of part-time work in an entirely different kitchen years before she had ever set foot in a restaurant like Aldrine. If our positions had been reversed, if I had been the one running that floor for 15 years and a new server had shouted her way into my kitchen with nothing but a hunch, I think I would have reacted the exact same way Solange did. She told me, still in that same controlled voice, that she needed to think about whether this was the kind of judgment call she could trust on her floor going forward. And that comment landed harder than anything else she said that night, because it was not about the allergy at all anymore. It was about whether I still had a job at Aldrine, and everyone standing in that kitchen understood exactly what she meant, even though she never said the actual words out loud in front of the cooks. Thomas, to his credit, tried to soften the moment slightly by pointing out that the flour had, in fact, been confirmed as the exact allergen in question, but Solange cut him off gently, not unkindly, and said that being right after the fact did not automatically make the method acceptable, and that if we let every server decide for themselves when the normal rules did not apply, the restaurant would not survive a single month of that precedent. I did not argue with her in that moment, because I understood there was nothing useful I could say that would change how serious a breach I had committed in terms of how a professional kitchen was supposed to run, no matter how correct the outcome had turned out to be. What I did not know yet, standing there with my hands still faintly trembling and the adrenaline finally starting to drain out of my legs, was that the coordinator Solange had called to confirm the allergy details was about to tell her something that would change the entire shape of the conversation happening in that kitchen, something that had nothing to do with whether I had overstepped my role and everything to do with just how close that plate had actually come to leaving the building. Solange stepped away from the pass for a moment to take the call from the event coordinator, and the kitchen settled into an uneasy kind of quiet, the normal clatter of service resuming around the edges, while everyone near the pass kept stealing glances at her back, trying to read her posture for some clue about what was being said on the other end of the line. Tomas set the open container of bean flour down on a clean corner of the counter, away from any active plating, and for the first time since I had burst through the doors, he looked directly at me without any trace of irritation left in his expression, only something closer to curiosity. He asked me, quietly enough that the rest of the line could not really hear him over the ambient noise, how I had actually recognized the flour from that far away, and I told him the truth, the same thing I had already told Solange about my aunt's bakery and the almond flour incident that had happened years before I ever started working there, and about the training she had drilled into every single person who touched her production line afterward. He nodded slowly while I explained it, and I could see him running the information against everything he already knew about ingredients and cross-contamination, the way any serious cook automatically checks a new fact against an internal library built over years of professional experience. He said, almost to himself, that he had never once considered legume cross-reactivity as a category the way he automatically considered nut allergies, because in his training, the two had always been treated as separate concerns, and that this was clearly a gap he needed to think about more carefully going forward, not just for that night, but for how his kitchen labeled and tracked ingredient substitutions in general. Solange came back a few minutes later, her phone still in her hand, and her expression had changed in a way that was immediately obvious, even from several feet away. The sharp, controlled anger from before had not disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by something else, a kind of pale seriousness that made Thomas straighten up slightly where he stood. She told us that she had spoken with the event coordinator and that in confirming the allergy details one final time, the coordinator had mentioned something that had not been on the original sheet at all, something that had apparently been communicated verbally to the restaurant's events line by an assistant a few days earlier, but had never made it onto the written document Solange had been working from all night. The regional vice president, the man with the documented legume allergy, had a history significant enough that his own colleagues at the table carried an epinephrine injector on his behalf as a standard precaution whenever he traveled for work events, because a previous reaction years earlier had escalated fast enough that he no longer trusted himself to manage the initial symptoms alone before help could arrive. The coordinator told Solange that the last time a mistake had happened around his allergy, at a different company event almost 3 years earlier, he had gone into anaphylaxis within about 11 minutes of eating a dish that contained a hidden legume derivative and had needed emergency treatment on site before an ambulance arrived. Hearing that detail land in the middle of that kitchen changed the entire weight of what had almost happened. This was not a theoretical risk anymore, a line on a sheet that might have caused mild discomfort if missed. It was a specific, documented, near-fatal history sitting at a table 30 feet from where 4 plates containing exactly the substance that had nearly killed him once before had been sitting on a rail, garnished and finished, one delivery away from reaching him again. Solange was quiet for a moment after she finished relaying that information, and I watched her look at the container of bean flour still sitting on the counter where Tomas had left it, and then look at me, and something in her face shifted again, settling into an expression I had not seen from her before, somewhere between relief and a kind of sober recalculation of everything she had said to me only minutes earlier. She did not make a speech about it. She was not the type of manager who turned a moment like that into a public performance of admitting she had been wrong, and I do not think she needed to, because everyone standing in that kitchen had just heard the same information at the same time and understood exactly what it meant without her having to say it out loud. What she said instead, after a long pause, was that she still meant what she had told me about the chain of command, that servers walking into kitchens and shouting down chefs could not become a normal way of doing things at Aldrine, and that she needed me to understand that distinction clearly. But she also said, looking directly at me rather than past me the way she had during the sharper part of our exchange, that she was not going to pretend the outcome of what I had done that night was anything other than exactly what it was, and that the restaurant, and more specifically, a man she had never met sitting in the back dining room with his colleagues, owed a debt to a piece of judgment that she could not have trained into a new server through any onboarding checklist she had ever written. She did not offer me a raise on the spot or make any grand promise about my future at Aldrine, and I think that restraint was part of what made the moment feel real rather than performed. What she did do, once the modified chickpea dish had gone out clean about 18 minutes later, was pull me aside near the end of service, after the private room had finished dessert and the last of the pharmaceutical company employees were gathering coats near the front, and tell me quietly that she wanted to sit down with me the following week to talk about cross-training me on some floor lead responsibilities, something she said she had honestly not been planning to bring up for at least another 6 months under normal circumstances. She said it without any dramatic flourish, simply as a practical decision made by someone who had just watched a relatively new employee demonstrate a level of attention and nerve that most of her experienced staff had never been tested on, let alone shown they possessed. Tomas, for his part, did something I did not expect at all before the night was over. Near the very end of service, once the kitchen had wound down to the slow rhythm of closing side work, he walked over to where I was rolling silverware at the server station and set the now empty container of bean flour down on the counter next to me. He told me he had already relabeled the entire shelf of working containers in the walk-in that afternoon prep crew used, writing the actual ingredient name on every single one in permanent marker, and that he was going to start cross-referencing any new ingredient substitution against the house allergy binder before it ever touched a line, a system that had simply never existed before that night, because nobody had ever needed it to exist. At least not that anyone in that kitchen had realized. He did not thank me in a long or emotional way. He just said that he owed me for catching something he should have built a system to catch on his own, and that the container was going to sit on a shelf in his office from now on as a reminder, unlabeled, exactly as it had been that night, so he would never again assume that experience alone was enough to prevent something like this from happening. I finished my shift a little after midnight, and I remember standing outside near the delivery entrance where I had gone to look for Solange earlier that same evening, the parking lot mostly empty, except for a couple of cars belonging to the closing crew, and feeling the specific kind of exhaustion that comes after your body has been running on adrenaline for hours, and finally has nothing left to burn. I thought about how close the entire situation had come to going the other way, how easily I could have talked myself out of walking through those doors at all, how the difference between a very good story and a genuine tragedy that night had come down to a texture I remembered from a bakery job I had almost forgotten I ever had. I still have not fully explained to anyone at Aldrine exactly how certain I was standing at that pass, Because the honest answer is that I was never 100% certain, not in the way people like to imagine certainty working in stories like this. I was maybe 70% certain, built on a color and a texture and a smell I half remembered from 2 years earlier, and I made the decision that 70% certain was still far too high a number to stay quiet about, when the alternative was watching a plate leave a kitchen that could put a man in an ambulance. That container still sits on a shelf in Thomas's office as far as I know, empty, unlabeled, exactly the way he left it, and every time I walk past his door and catch a glimpse of it, I think about how much can hinge on one small detail nobody else in the room happened to be looking at. If you want to hear the next story from this channel, the subscribe button is sitting right there below this video, and it costs you nothing but a single tap to make sure you do not miss whatever comes next.